The cursor blinked, a rhythmic pulse against the dark screen. Ethan Carter did not look up. His fingers moved across the keyboard in a steady, deliberate cadence, translating logic into a functional framework. Outside his window, the air was thick with the shouting of his friends. They were gathered in the hallway, phones held high, voices pitched to a frantic frequency as they traded crypto tokens, chasing the latest spike in value. Every few seconds, a cheer or a curse erupted through the thin walls. Ethan ignored it. He was not looking for a windfall. He was building a tool to automate business contracts, a process defined by tedious, line-by-line architecture. He paused for a heartbeat, the silence of his desk amplifying the noise outside. He heard the desperation in their voices, the hunger for overnight gain. He took a breath, adjusted his posture, and turned his focus back to the terminal. The code was messy, full of errors that needed cleaning. He pressed a key, watched the syntax highlight, and began the next sequence. He was not interested in the trend. He was building the foundation. The screen remained a wall of shifting variables. Ethan leaned back, the chair springs groaning in the quiet room. He reached for a worn book resting on the corner of his desk. The pages were soft, edges frayed from constant handling. He flipped through until he reached the marked passage. His eyes traced the ink. A definite purpose is the starting point of all achievement. He let the words sit in the air. There were no venture capitalists calling his phone, no hype cycles building momentum for his work. Just the steady hum of the server fan and the reality of a project that demanded more than it promised. He closed the book, the sound sharp in the stillness. He had nothing but his own time to trade. He set the book aside, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the desk, and turned back to the keyboard. The isolation was not a burden. It was a choice. He typed the first function of the new module, his movements precise and unhurried. The goal was no longer just to finish the code. The goal was to prove the logic of his commitment. He began to type, faster now, the rhythm of the keys echoing the steady beat of his intent. Months of isolation funneled into this single afternoon. Ethan stood in a sterile conference room, his laptop connected to the main projector. He initiated the demo. The interface loaded, the modules firing in sequence. The Prospectace's client leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. Ethan clicked the primary function to execute the contract sync. The cursor stalled. It hovered over the button, a frozen icon against the dashboard. He clicked again. The system response time spiked. A red error banner tore across the top of the display, followed by a system-wide hang. The hum of his laptop fans rose to a high-pitched whine. The room went silent. The client looked from the screen to Ethan, then back to the frozen interface. Ethan tapped the escape key, then the power command, but the software remained locked in a fatal loop. The lines of code he had spent months refining were now just static, unresponsive text on a wall. The demo was dead. He pulled the cable from the port, the plastic connector clicking as it slid out. The screen went black. The realization was not a feeling, but a cold, hard fact. The architecture had failed. The conference room door clicked shut. Ethan was alone. He sat back down and stared at the lines of code that had brought his demo to its knees. He tried to patch the sync function, typing rapidly, ignoring the fatigue in his wrists. He compiled. The error persisted. He tried again, tracing the data flow, isolating variables, forcing the sync to hold. It crashed again. The failure was not a bug, it was systemic. The database structure could not handle the concurrent load he had built it for. He sat back, his hands hovering over the keys. There was no way to salvage the existing build. He reached for his mouse and highlighted the primary data schema. With one deliberate movement, he pressed delete. The terminal cleared. He began to map out a new architecture, block by block, relationship by relationship. He did not look at the clock. He did not look at his phone. He erased months of work to replace it with a design that could actually endure. The cursor blinked, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the dark. He started the refactor from the ground up, writing the first query of a new, more rigid system. The work was massive. He did not blink. The refactoring required more than just time. It demanded processing power that his local machine could not provide. Ethan opened his banking portal. The balance was meant for a trip he had promised himself years ago. He looked at the server invoices stacking up in his inbox. Each new architecture layer needed a dedicated environment to test for stability. He clicked on the transfer button. The number in his account dropped by half. Then it dropped again. He watched the digits shrink, replacing his travel plans with rows of virtual hardware. There was no cushion left. He closed the browser and stared at the terminal. The code was live on the cloud, humming away in a data center halfway across the country. He had bought himself more time, but he had also burned his safety net. If this build failed, he had no backup funds to sustain the project. He stood up and paced the narrow width of his room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He had no travel brochures now, only server logs and a mounting debt to his own future. He sat back down and opened the primary database file. The stakes were no longer just professional, they were absolute. He typed the first line of the new deployment sequence. The clock on the wall blurred at 3 a.m. Ethan rubbed his eyes, the skin dry and irritated, but his fingers did not stop moving. The apartment was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the cooling fan working overtime. He had lived in this rhythm for weeks. Coffee grounds piled up in the bin, and the sunlight was a foreign concept he had not seen in days. A red notification flashed on his secondary monitor, a latency spike in the staging environment. He froze. Every instinct screamed for rest, for the comfort of a bed just 10 feet away, but he leaned into the desk instead. He opened the logs. The data was bottlenecking. He began the extraction, line by line, hunting for the memory leak that threatened to stall the entire build. His head throbbed, but he ignored the physical signal, focusing only on the stream of numbers scrolling past. He found the rogue function. He deleted it, replaced it with a leaner recursive loop, and watched the latency graph drop back to green. He leaned back, his chair creaking in the stillness. He had saved the build, but he had no time to celebrate. He closed the window, opened a fresh source file, started the next module. The cycle continued. The notification pinged at midday. Ethan reached for the mouse, his heart rate spiking with the reflex of 2 years of system failures. He expected a server crash report or a database timeout. Instead, the screen displayed a digital signature request from a regional logistics firm. He blinked, staring at the bold text. He refreshed the page. A second notification appeared instantly. A hardware supplier had submitted their onboarding documents. The silence of the room, usually heavy with the weight of isolation, suddenly felt different. He clicked through the contract terms, his hand steady as he verified the routing numbers. The logistics firm needed real-time tracking integration. The hardware supplier required automated inventory reconciliation. They were not just testing his software, they were committing to it. He leaned back in his chair, the tension that had been locked into his shoulders for 2 years finally dissipating. He looked at the 2 signatures glowing on his monitor. These were not just lines of code anymore. They were the first tangible returns on a gamble that had cost him his savings and his sleep. He checked the status again. The integration was live. The system was holding. He had moved past the point of survival, and for the first time, he saw the path ahead clear of the fog. The first week was a trial by fire. The logistics firm pushed their entire regional operation through the portal, followed by the hardware supplier. Ethan watched the terminal, his fingers hovering over the kill switch, waiting for the inevitable crash. The transaction counter ticked upward 100, 500, then 900. The server load spiked as a massive batch of inventory data hit the buffer, straining the memory allocation. The system stuttered for a heartbeat, the progress bar stalling at 99%. Ethan held his breath, watching the CPU usage climb. Then, the bar cleared, the 1,000th contract finalized. A green success message blinked on the screen, signaling the system had processed the entitlement workload without a single error. The tension in his chest evaporated, replaced by a steady, rhythmic pulse of activity. Within hours, the revenue metrics began to shift. The dashboard, once stagnant with zero-sum results, updated with incoming payments that grew in frequency. It was no longer a trickle. Each transaction represented a verified contract, a solved logistical problem, and a piece of digital infrastructure that actually worked. He watched the numbers climb, the platform scaling seamlessly to meet the demand, turning his years of isolated labor into an unstoppable flow of commerce. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the servers. Ethan sat before his monitor, his cursor blinking atop the annual audit file. He opened the document, his eyes tracing the rows of processed contracts, the overhead costs, and the steady accumulation of capital. He navigated to the final page, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. He had spent 2 years expecting failures, debugging errors, and bracing for the next system collapse. He scrolled down to the bottom line, expecting a modest profit, perhaps enough to cover the next year of server leases. Instead, the final number sat there, bold and definitive. He leaned back, staring at the screen. He reread the total. 7 figures. His net worth had officially surpassed $1 million. The reality of the sum did not hit him as a grand celebration. It hit him as a physical weight, the accumulation of thousands of hours spent in the dark, the missed sleep, and the relentless refactoring of his own code. He looked around the small room, the space that had served as his workspace, his laboratory, and his sanctuary. The $1 million figure was no longer a theoretical goal or a distant dream. It was the quantifiable proof of his persistence. He closed the document, his hands steady, and looked at the empty desk space beside him. The work was finished, yet the momentum was just beginning. A soft knock sounded at the door. A young intern stepped inside, his gaze shifting between the servers and the screen. He asked the question that had been circulating in the industry for months. What was the secret to thriving in the blockchain space? Ethan turned his chair away from the monitor. He did not talk about algorithms, market timing, or volatility. He simply reached toward the shelf and tapped the spine of a worn, weathered book. He looked the intern in the eye and said, "Technology is just a tool. Persistence toward a purpose is the engine." The intern stood silent, processing the answer, but Ethan was already turning back to his desk. The $1 million figure on the audit mattered less than the blank terminal waiting for his input. He opened a new file, his fingers finding the keys with the same rhythm he had used during the lean years. He was not looking for the next trend to exploit. He was looking for the next problem to solve. The cycle of labor continued, not because he had to, but because the work was the point. He typed the first line of a new feature, ignoring the noise of the market outside, focused entirely on the architecture of his next creation.